Morning, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's a great crowd. It must have had something to do with we did talk around a little bit and tried to build up some interest this morning, and I talked about how Congressman Cole was going to share his secrets on how he was going to solve all the problems in Washington and bring the congregation together, and maybe that's why you're here. So we do look forward to hearing from Tom later, and we're very honored to have him here with us this morning. I'd also like to start out by thanking our signature sponsor, which is Gardner Tannenbaum Holdings. Thank you again for sponsoring this breakfast. For many years, the Chamber has hosted chairman events to provide a forum for members to gain insight in the key issues facing nation's businesses. The chairman's breakfast, along with other events that we host, are intended to foster important dialogue with officials, elected officials, and that we believe, based on our belief, that a greater awareness of the issues will drive and will make you more involved in the political process, which is very important. You know, if you don't like this is probably the wrong audience for this message, but if you don't like the direction of our state, city, or nation, and you really don't get involved, you really have no one to blame for yourself. And so I'm glad we have such a great turnout, because I can tell you care and you are involved. So thank you very much for being here. Also, though, if you do need a little bit of help, in your seat you'll find some materials about how to stay informed and get involved through the Chamber. The continued growth of our region's economy depends on providing the right business climate. One attracts capital in terms of money, and capital in terms of human resources and educated populace. Your Chamber is actively engaged at state, local, and federal levels to support the adoption of policies that support economic development. And while much progress has been made, much progress is needed. The 2013 legislative session, I believe, is one of the most successful for pro-business interests in Oklahoma's history, with significant victories, including the passage of historic workers' compensation reform, the protection of key economic development incentives, the enactment of key pension reform measures, and more. We are seeing our region become more and more recognized across the country as a good place to do business. However, in terms of progress needed, a priority has to be the area of education, particularly K through 12. Our economy continues to change structurally. 20 years ago, some 75% of the jobs in the economy were available to those who only had a high school diploma. Today, only 40% of the jobs in the economy is available to those with a high school diploma. And of course, as you know, unfortunately, our public schools are graduating, I think, 50% or less in terms of matriculation and awarding high school diplomas. So I don't think even Washington can make that math work. I mean, they do some creative things, but it's not a good situation. It's only going to get worse if you project that out. And so a particular concern, I think, of ours is the potential and the threat of rolling back of reforms that have already been made, such as the Common Core standards. Those standards were developed by the National Governors Association Center for Best Practices and the Council of Chief State School Officers, not the federal government, as some may suggest. On the national level, however, we are very fortunate to have Tom Cole in Congress working hard for us. Congressman Tom Cole is a great Oklahoman and an American we can be proud of, not only for his leadership, but the values he displays in public service. Well, I know you're anxious to hear from Congressman Cole on how he's going to take on the issues facing our nation. We're going to begin the program a little later. Now, please just enjoy your breakfast. Thank you. We are honored to have Congressman Tom Cole with us this morning. Tom's currently serving his 6th term. Tom was elected to Congress in 2002. He was identified by Time magazine as one of the sharpest minds in the House. And I have to agree. I have met with Tom on many occasions and am always impressed with his depth of knowledge on a very wide range of issues. And given his background in history, he's also able to bring a sense of historical perspective to our most serious problems. Cole's an advocate for strong national defense, a tireless advocate for taxpayers and small businesses, and a leader on issues dealing with Native Americans and tribal governments. Since 2009, Tom has served on the powerful House Appropriations Committee and has been assigned to the subcommittees on Defense, Interior and Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development. He has served on the House Budget Committee since 2011 and was recently appointed to serve on the House Rules Committee. In addition, Congressman Cole serves as Deputy Whip for the Republican Conference and is a member of the Republican Steering Committee. Tom is a fifth-generation Oklahoman and enrolled member of the Chickasaw Nation, of which he is very proud. Please join me in welcoming United States Congressman Tom Cole.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Really a pleasure for me to be here. I love that line, by the way, one of the 5 sharpest minds in the House. You know, my staff always sticks that into the deal, and when the reporter who wrote it, Michael Greenwell, is a friend, I called him up and said, Michael, that was such a nice thing to say. And he said, Tom, don't get carried away. Look at the guys I'm comparing you with. So, and, you know, when we got this invitation, I was thrilled to get it because, I mean, do you guys know what our approval rating is? You could take Mick's approval rating, divide it by 10, and we still would be about half of that. So I think the last time I saw anything about Congress, the approval rating was 6%. 6%. You take away paid staff and blood relatives, there's not a lot left out there for us these days. And it does remind me of one brief story. It's one of my favorite stories. Some of you have probably heard it before because I love this story because it so encapsulates what the American people think of Congress right now. The story was brought to me by Dana Rohrabacher. Dana is a longtime member of Congress from California, but before he was in Congress, he was elected in 1988, he wrote speeches for Ronald Reagan for 8 years. So he's got a pretty good ear for a great quip or a great story or anecdote. He came back from a series of town hall meetings one day and had a group of us over for dinner, and he said, there's this story going all over my district that really encapsulates what the American people think about each and every one of us right now. And the story goes like this. There was a congressman who was speeding through a school zone. Local police officer sees him, pulls him over, walks up to him and says, Congressman, you know, you're speeding through that school zone. Can I see your license? And the congressman looks at him and says, Officer, I'm sorry, I don't have a driver's license. Not a good thing to say to a cop normally. Then he goes on and says, and, you know, just to be honest, if you were to open my trunk, you'd find there's illegal drugs in the trunk. And just to be completely forthright, if you were to open my glove box, you'd find I have an illegal, unregistered firearm in there. It's about all the cop needs to hear. He pulls his own weapon and says, don't move, I'm calling for backup. Radio's in. The police chief hears this, hears the congressman's name, knows this is not a good thing, comes racing out, talks to his officer, walks over to the congressman and says, Congressman, can I see your driver's license? And the congressman said, sure. Chief pulls it out, hands it to him, everything's in order. And he says, well, Congressman, do you mind if I look in your trunk? Absolutely not. Opens it up, nothing but the tire tool. He says, well, Congressman, could I look in your glove box? Absolutely, Chief. Opens it up, nothing in there but the insurance papers and the registration for the car. So he gives his officer a pretty dirty look, and he turns back to Congress. He said, now, Congressman, something's going on here. My officer told me that you didn't have a driver's license, but you do. He told me that there were illegal drugs in the trunk, but I've checked and there's not. And he said you had an illegal, unregistered firearm in your glove box, but there's nothing there. Can you explain this to me? The congressman just looks at him and says, yeah, and I bet you the son of a gun told you I was speeding too. So, kind of where our credibility is with the American people right now. And I've been trying to think of what a theme would be to talk to you about what's going on in D.C., because there's a lot of different things. And the thing that came to my mind was the good, the bad, and the ugly from the old Clint Eastwood movie. So let's just move through it quickly. On the good side, there actually are some things that have happened this year. First of all, deficit this year is half of what it was 3 years ago. Now, that's still $650 billion. But half in 3 years, that's a pretty major thing. And it seems to get lost in the discussion. When Republican Congress came in, the deficit was running about $1.3 to $1 trillion annually. And that's come down. So there really has been some tough fiscal restraint. Second, while people say we never passed anything at all, let's just talk about what's happened this year. At the beginning of Congress, the very end of the last Congress, the so-called fiscal cliff debate was resolved, and the Bush tax cuts for 98% of the American people, representing about 85% of all the money, were made permanent. Not likely to change either. Permanent. That was a big deal. Yeah. And for those of you that make more than $450,000 a year, I'm sorry. You didn't get everything, but capital gains and dividends at 20 and 20 locked in permanently, state tax at 5 and 5, index for inflation at 40%. That's a lot better than 55% for anything over $1 million. So major gains on that front, I think, at the end of the day. And then if you look through the first 3 months of the year, Hurricane Sandy relief got done. Now, that was very controversial at the time, but if you don't think it matters, just go to more. I know Mick worked with it because the FEMA fund, the disaster relief fund, was refilled during that. The money that we're operating on now, that FEMA's operating on, working with our local governments here, is all out of Hurricane Sandy relief. All that money was put back in. Absent that solution, we would have been up a creek without the proverbial paddle. And then the Violence Against Women Act. Now, only Congress would struggle over the Violence Against Women Act. Like, who is for violence against women that's in office? But it got done in the end of the day, and with a significant advancement, quite frankly, for tribal governments, which was a key component of the package. So those were all pretty good things. Then in March, we looked like we might have a government shutdown. You didn't hear much about it because it actually got solved 2 or 3 weeks ahead of time, and we're now running on that money through the end of September. This last month, with all the contention, all the fights, the student loan issue was fixed on a bipartisan basis. Strangely enough, Republican bill very closely mirrored what President Obama had wanted to do. And then finally, the Democrats in the Senate came around and we got that done. It's a big deal in a district like mine where we've got 5 colleges and universities. So that's a pretty big piece of progress. Each house has now passed a farm bill. There's been a lot of contention in that, but my guess is we'll get that done. Frank Lucas will probably get it done before the end of September or into early October. That's an extraordinarily important thing. And I think the most interesting and uncommented thing of all was the debate that we've had in the wake of Edmund Snowden's disclosures about the National Security Agency, where there was an effort to totally end the program. Now, we can debate the merits of the program, but the president, Democratic president, felt very strongly this was in the national security interest of the United States. He opposed the amendment, and guess who helped him beat it? The majority of Republicans voted with the president and with Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership against the majority of Democrats who actually opposed their own president on the issue. So the idea that there's not some bipartisanship and cross workings is just simply not the case. So that's the good. What's the bad? Well, the bad is the process is still not moving very smoothly. The Senate has not passed a single appropriations bill this year. The House has only moved 4 through. We've seen, if anything, more rigid partisan battles leading into the fall. And we're now in a great debate, which I don't think we should be having, over whether or not we should shut down the government in order to get rid of Obamacare. Now, let me make this abundantly clear. Nobody opposes Obamacare probably more than I do, or certainly more than this delegation has. Every single Oklahoman, and that's still when we had a Democrat, my good friend Dan Bourne in the delegation voted against Obamacare. And each of us that have been there in the House have now voted 40 times to repeal or replace it. So it's not as if we have any strong fans. And all of us would defund it if we could. And we've actually passed 7 bills, this always gets lost, that have gotten rid of about $62 billion worth of the expense and some of the regulation. For instance, any of you in business, the original bill, you were going to have to fill out a 1040 for every $600 purchase that you had. Even the president at the end of the day said, that probably isn't a very smart idea. We passed the legislation in the House, the Senate, he signed it. We had an assisted living portion of it that Secretary Sebelius looked at it and said, that is going to go bankrupt. It is not very good. We got rid of it. So there have been actually some changes, and we would push further. But at the end of the day, if you shut down the government, you change the discussion from why Obamacare isn't a good idea to why in the world are you shutting down the government? And the consequences of that are pretty simple. First of all, it's a complete shutdown. We haven't passed any appropriations bills. This isn't like 1995, where more than half the federal government, including the military, continued to work. So the first thing that happens, no troops in the field are going to get paid. Or your veterans hospitals and your veterans homes all shut down. Or the National Weather Center, which did such a wonderful job giving us some warning in our recent tornadoes, ends and shuts down. Or Kerr Laboratories, that does important work on water and shuts down. Or the FAA Center shuts down. All those things happen, and sooner or later, you'll have to turn the switch back on, sooner in all likelihood, and the president will not have capitulated in that time frame. But you will have made yourselves, I think, by shutting down the government, be incredibly irresponsible. You don't ever make threats in any business, but certainly not in politics, that you're not prepared to carry through. And that one is just not a good idea. But it's a possibility. We have people, talking about that and advocating it and promoting it. I think it's a bad, bad mistake. Okay, what's the ugly? The ugly is what's going to happen or could happen between the time we get back right after Labor Day and the end of the year. We have both an incredible challenge and an amazing opportunity. We have two triggering events. All government spending ends on September the 30th, and we'll probably hit the debt ceiling sometime around mid-November. That provides the opportunity and for a big deal, a really big deal that would actually turn off the sequester, which otherwise will continue and will cause a lot of problems here at Tinker and Fort Sill, but also could finally get us over to dealing with the real long-term drivers of the debt, which are Medicare, Medicaid, longer-term Social Security, food stamps, all the entitlement programs that continue to go on. About 60% of the whole budget, which is largely sheltered from any kind of cuts. That is an opportunity worth seizing, because if you can deal with the debt and the deficit in the context of that, you can actually turn some of the parts of government back on that people like, avoid the furloughs, and yet actually deal with the real long-term nature of the debt. I choose to be optimistic because I've seen the president actually put some things on the table that for the first time he's caught some heat for. In his budget, he talked about what's called chain CPI, which would just simply slow the increase, the inflationary increase in Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. But over a decade, that's worth $300 to $400 billion. He's talked about means testing for Medicare. Now that I'm 64, this is an extraordinarily important issue to me. The type of means testing would be something like we do already in Medicare Part D. I mean, basically, it's not very onerous, but let's be real, Warren Buffett doesn't really need exactly the same kind of Medicare program that Ma and Pa Kettle do. So you deal with that. And he's also talked about $400 billion worth of cuts in addition to Medicare longer term without a lot of specificity. Those are tough things for a Democrat to put on the table, and I give the president a lot of credit for doing that. On the other hand, he's also asked for additional revenue increases. Now, I think he can get the sequester turned off, but additional revenue would be pretty tough. And I've had this discussion with the White House. For the first reason, you got revenue at the beginning of the year with no spending cuts. That's what the fiscal cliff was, $600 billion more of revenue. And you could have had more if you'd have wanted, because you didn't have to, roll back the Bush tax cuts as far as you do. But, that was his choice. That was a deal negotiated between Vice President Biden and Leader McConnell, basically. Second, you just got another round of tax increases for Obamacare. A lot of those taxes kick in 2014. The idea that you're going to get a third round of revenue increases, or tax increases, let's call them what they are, I think is exceedingly unlikely, and very unlikely to happen in a Republican House, even if you thought it was a good idea. Far better to look at linking this with tax reform, where there's actually been some bipartisan work. I don't think you could get it done by the end of the year, but you could have a pathway to a larger, grander deal. Now, that's the opportunity. The danger, of course, is by waiting to the last minute and with the partisan gridlock that we have and with people on each side of the political spectrum, advocating what are rather reckless tactics, you could have a colossal train wreck. And make no mistake about it, while we have some people, certainly on the Republican side, I think they've advocated what I would consider a high-risk strategy. The same thing's true on the Democratic side. According to the press, there are some advisors to the president who are recommending if they don't give you a bill that turns off the sequester, veto it, and we'll shut down the government and blame it on them. That's not a good strategy, and I don't think the president at the end of the day would do something like that. I would hope not, but the mere fact that it's being considered, I think, suggests both sides need to cool off a little bit, go back to their corners, and rethink, what they want to do going forward. Let me end with a couple of other quick comments. First, we talk a lot about when government doesn't work, and heaven knows many, many times it does not work well and costs too much and doesn't deliver. On the other hand, I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks dealing with our good friends at the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and I got to tell you how well it has worked in my part of the world. I know Mick's been dealing with the mayor. I should say the mayor. I shouldn't say Mick, but politicians actually like to be called by their first names. Titles are not too good these days. But the reality is, we got good warning thanks to the National Weather Service, and we got great response, and we've had exceptional local and state leadership here at the municipal levels, the county levels, and certainly with Governor Fallin as well. And so government has worked pretty well, in the aftermath of a crisis here. That's something worth thinking about when you talk about shutting it all down and turning it all off. And least people think that it's not still a dangerous world out there and our government doesn't play a role in protecting us. Just think about the NSA alerts that have happened in the last few days around the world, and think about how serious a threat is that triggers the closure of 21 embassies and the warnings of Americans to leave a particular country, in this case Yemen. That's a pretty big deal. That tells you something about the size of the threat, but it also tells you something about the sophistication of the intelligence network that actually located the threat and has been very capable at eliminating a lot of threats and saving a lot of Americans. We've had over 50 attacks, 10 that would have been on the United States, 40 on American facilities overseas that have been foiled in the last decade. Because of really extraordinary work by our intelligence, our security, our military personnel. So, again, take my hat off to them. And while I complain about the government, I thank God every day that I live behind the shield of the great Republic of the United States of America. That's why we can gather here. Pete was kind enough to mention I used to be an historian. I evidently wasn't very good at it, or I wouldn't be doing this. But I do like to think about things historically. And let me just end with this. We are in a relatively contentious and difficult time in our history. And that's not new. That's sort of the price of being an American. We sort of had 10 years off, between really the collapse of the Soviet Union and the onset of 9/11. We had a great decade economically in the 1990s, and we sort of thought of that as the new normal. But if you think back on our history, there's a lot of crisis and turning points, and most of them are a lot more serious than the one that we're living through today. This isn't 1776. We didn't, only Americans would wake up one morning and say, we got no federal government, got no functioning army, no functioning navy. Let's just take on the greatest empire the world's ever seen. I bet we could beat those guys head on at. And they did. And then you'd think it was all rosy, but the reality is, come 1787, things weren't working very well. Only Americans would say, let's get 54 of the smartest guys we know, lock them up in a really hot room in Philadelphia all summer long. I bet you they could write like the Constitution of the United States that would last longer than any other governing doctrine in the history of the world. And only Americans, could say, gosh, we need to deal with the challenges of the Civil War, fight a great Civil War. It's not 1861. We're not going to kill 600,000 Americans in the next 4 years because we can't resolve our problems through our political process. Or if you're my age and your dad got born into the Depression in Oklahoma, and as he said, just when we were getting out of it, the United States government came to me with a wonderful opportunity. They said, son, what would you like to do? Would you like to go fight Japanese in the Pacific, or would you prefer Germans in Europe? And, even, compared to the great, turmoil of Vietnam or, Watergate or what have you, we are not living in an incredibly contentious period, by standards. But it is a tough time. But I would suggest that this is just simply the test that this generation gets. Every American gets a test. Every generation has a challenge. Every one of us has dealt with it. This one will deal with this one as well. So in the next few months, as you see us yelling at one another and pointing fingers and behaving like juveniles, just remember you live in the greatest republic in the history of the world, and that its institutions are incredibly strong and powerful, and that its people are amazingly decent and sophisticated and tolerant. And they have overcome every obstacle in their path before, and they will overcome these as well. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom, for that great insight in what's going on in Washington and that historical perspective. We are running early, so we do have some time for Q&A. I think one of the questions may be, who's Mom, Paul Kettle, given that generational difference here. It was usually one of my favorite shows growing up, but you may get a question on that. But really, it's a great opportunity to get your questions answered about Washington, so please, we do have some mics available, walking around the room. Somebody like a Paul Renfro, somebody very informed, would be great to ask a question. It works for me.
No pressure there.
But Percy Kirk.
Congressman, thanks for being here this morning. Can you share with us your views on what it will take to fix immigration?
Yeah, it's going to be, incredibly difficult problem. And I would actually say some progress was made in the Senate, not enough. To me, there's three major issues here. I mean, the first is border security, which we don't have. Now, the Senate bill increased it and improved it, double the size of the Border Patrol, more technology, what have you. And the CBO, Congressional Budget Office, estimates that were that bill implemented, it would curtail illegal immigration by 1/3 to 1/2. That's better than what we've got, but that's not good enough by a long stretch. The second thing you've got to deal with is internal enforcement. And one of the things the Senate bill had is what's called E-Verify, where you could instantly check somebody's Social Security background. If it turns out there's 6 John Smiths out there, with the same number, maybe you got a problem. And that's probably a good idea because that's the real magnet that brings people here. The third thing is, what do you do with people that are already here? Now, there's going to be a lot of discussion about is there an amnesty program? That is a very charged and loaded word, but there is no amnesty program. That was tried in '86, it failed, and it will never happen again. What is in the Senate bill, which I don't support, by the way, and I'll move to what I do in a minute, but it is a background check. You got to know English, you got to be employed, you got to pay a fine, you got to go to the very back of the line. Now, we can argue whether that's enough or not, but it's not amnesty, and nobody's arguing that we should have amnesty. Have to be consequences to breaking the laws and coming here illegally. Okay, now if you get border security and internal enforcement, the real challenge is you have 11 million people here that are here illegally, most of whom are working hard, most of whom came here like any other immigrants in the history of the country to work hard and try and do better by their families. Now, when I have a rowdy town hall meeting about this, I usually remind people, look, I'm Chickasaw Indian, so as far as I'm concerned, all you guys are illegal. We'll just start from there as to who gets to stay and why. But at the end of the day, we're not going to do that. We're not going to round up 11 million people. So what's wrong with the Senate bill? What needs to be changed? First of all, you can't have legalization and then enforcement, or path to citizenship and then enforcement. You got to have enforcement first, and it's got to be in a manner the American people really believe it, because they were told this was going to happen before, and it didn't happen. Now, when I see people like my friend Tom Cole, who I think has spent a lot of time on this issue, tell me that the Senate bill will not fix it, I believe him. He's also on the Intelligence Committee. We've got to have more there, and you've got to have objective criteria that have to be met. And it has to not be up to the administration to decide. I mean, the administration really hurt itself during the immigration debate by doing two things, one of which is related, one unrelated. The first was when the president unilaterally suspended some of the immigration laws on the, quote, Dreamers. Now, you can like it or not like it, but a president suspending a law because he doesn't like it, refusing to enforce it, raises doubts among his opponents as, hey, if we come to a deal, will he keep it? And he did the same thing on Obamacare when he waived the employer mandate for a year. Now, I'm glad he did that. I'd like him to do it for the individuals as well. If you can push this thing off, maybe over time you can change it or hopefully repeal it. But again, unilateral executive action is a problem. So you can't have the president or the executive branch by itself deciding when the border is secure, when there's internal security. The House approach is to take this in step-by-step, bite-size, sort of increments. From 4 bills have moved through the Judiciary Committee so far. They've not come to the floor for action, but they deal with everything for visas for highly educated people to seasonal labor, agricultural labor coming across. There are efforts to deal with the really concrete problems. And there's a couple more that are yet to come. My guess is those things will be wrapped up and sent to conference committee where the Senate bill will be, and then they'll have to hash out a compromise, and we'll see what comes out of that. The Speaker has committed that nothing goes to conference that doesn't have a majority of the Republicans supporting it, and nothing comes out of conference that doesn't have a majority supporting it. And he appoints the conferees on our side, so he's going to have something to say about that. So all I can tell you is it's a work in progress, and it's a difficult, hard, highly emotional debate. And where we end up, I don't know. One caveat, though, if we don't solve the fiscal issues in September and October and November, and that we don't have some sort of grand fiscal bargain that both sides can say, we both compromised, but we both got some things we wanted, then I can assure you that immigration won't happen. You've got to have some steps in here where the two sides actually do something big to create the trust and the bipartisanship that you need to move something through like immigration. The Speaker has said, I want a bill that the majority of Democrats can vote for and the majority of Republicans can vote for. He said, I think that's the only way you do this. And I think he's wise in doing that. He's tried to actually set back a little bit and just let the debate work itself out. So we'll see where we go, but that's kind of broadly where I'm at. But until you've got a final bill to vote on, it's kind of hard to tell you yay or nay.
Congressman, with the recent delay in the employer mandate portion of the Affordable Care Act, where do you see the delay going, and what do you see being the final outcome? Does it ever become law, or as it is intended to be?
That's an interesting question and really hard to tell. This is an extraordinarily unpopular law. We can debate the merits of it, but look, there's never been a major piece of legislation that has stayed this unpopular this long. The theory behind it was once you pass it, people will like it, and that'll reverse the numbers. I can assure you as an old pollster, that isn't true. And it's got serious defects. Again, we've changed it 7 times since it was written in major ways. And the president just put off the employer mandate a year. And you've got Howard Dean in the Wall Street Journal last week writing that the Independent Payment Advisory Board, which is the cost control mechanism for the whole thing, is going to collapse and won't work. Now, that suggests to me that the thing is falling under its own weight. I think it's going to be extraordinarily unpopular. Remember, 34 states haven't signed up. There's a fine editorial this morning's Oklahoman about what the consequences of that are. And Scott Pruitt, our own Attorney General, is still, in court, really, with a very significant lawsuit that might overturn this thing. So it's rocky at best. At the same time, I tell my Republican friends, this is better opposed one battlefield at a time, one piece of legislation at a time. Don't precipitate a climactic struggle by shutting down the government. I think that's the one thing that could save it. But over time, I just think it's going to be a very unpopular and very difficult deal. And when people start having to try to sign up for this thing on October the 1st, it is not going to magically become more popular. It's going to be much more difficult. So again, I think this is a tale of legislation. And this is very different than Medicare Part D, which there was a big fight over but nobody's tried to repeal, and actually everybody's liked, and everybody all the polls show it's pretty popular with the affected population of seniors. And this is not like Social Security and Medicare, as much as my Democratic friends like to argue the same thing was true then. There was significant bipartisan support in each one of those things, and certainly in subsequent expansions. This one has just never, for whatever reason, taken hold. I've never seen a piece of legislation provoke such a violent reaction. I will make this prediction. If you put it off for businesses, you're not going to be able to mandate it for individuals. I mean, I don't know why they didn't put them both off, quite honestly. I would think the individual mandate will be more difficult to enforce, and I can assure you it's less popular with the American people than the business mandate is. So I think the president's running for a really rocky rollout on this thing this year and into next year.
Congressman, first, thank you for your service. My question is, with the talk about downsizing of the military, could you share with us what your role in that process is and what effect it might have on our local economy?
Fighting and screaming every step of the way. I sit on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, so we appropriate the dollars to try and fund the American military. Before sequestration, we were already on a significant downward slope. Now, let me describe what that is. Currently, we have an Army of about 565,000 men and women. By 2017, it'll be 490,000, so 75,000 fewer soldiers. We currently have about 202,000 Marines. In 2017, it'll be about 180,000, so about 20,000 fewer Marines out there. We currently have 61 fighter aircraft wings. That'll drop to 54. We were going to have 313 combat vessels. That'll be at about 288. So we're talking really diminished capabilities, and that's before sequester. If sequester were to continue, then you can knock out across let's just say the Army, and I'm counting the reserve in this as well, you can knock out about another 100,000 soldiers. So you're talking extraordinary reduction in American military power. And it is, I'm one of these guys that just doesn't think it's a safer world with 75,000 fewer American soldiers and 20,000 fewer American Marines. I think it's a more dangerous world, and one that's much more likely to explode, and one in which the next president will not have the options that this president had because of the military he inherited from his predecessor. He will leave a smaller and weaker force than he got when he walked into office. I don't think that's good policy. So my role has been able to try and mitigate that where we can, work in a bipartisan fashion where we can. But honestly, I think that's dangerous. Now, in terms of the local economy, picture is not as bad in some ways as one might think. First of all, you've got the crown jewels at each end of this district of the American Air Force on one end and the American Army on the other. Up here at Tinker, the Air Logistics Center is absolutely critical. And guess what? If you had fewer airplanes and you're slowing down your acquisition, you got to keep your older airplanes flying longer. So it's not like there's going to be a shortage of work out here. If anything, the Tinker remains indispensable to the operation of American air power. I mean, it is probably the most complex single facility in the United States Air Force. So I think its future is very, very bright. The same thing is true at the other end. I mean, most people up here don't realize we've spent over $1.5 billion in Lawton, Oklahoma, in the last 10 years, 8 years, really. And that's the Air Defense Artillery School moving up from Texas. So they've expanded their size, increased everything, and we've been firing ordnance down there since it became the home of the field artillery in 1911. You really think we're going to do the environmental cost cleanup out on those ranges? Not going to happen. So those are, as long as you got a military, you're going to have artillery. And in modern warfare, you're going to need air defense artillery. So the missions are secure. The real question here is, as you diminish capability, and General Odierno put it really well at one of our defense subcommittee meetings, Defense Approach, he said, when he was asked what the impact of sequester would be, he said, look, we'll still do any mission that we're going to be asked to do by the President of the United States and the Congress of the United States, but more people are going to die more Americans are going to die. We're not going to have the training. We're not going to have the support. We'll go get it done one way or the other. But, when you make these kinds of decisions, particularly if it's done in a haphazard, across-the-board way, the way sequester is, you really weaken the ability and you put men and women's lives at risk. I think we have an obligation in Congress not to do that to the very best of our people who have signed up, put themselves in uniform, and said, put me in front of the rest of America, I'll go. I think we owe those people the very best that we have to give them in terms of equipment and training and survival.
Last question.
Boss told me to ask you questions. I was curious if you have any comments on the performance of our two freshman congressmen, two newest members of our delegation.
It's early to tell, actually, but they're on great committees. Bridenstine's on armed services. He got the last seat on there, and this is a guy that's flown in combat for the United States. He likes to call himself the guy that's been shot down the most because he played the Russians at Top Gun. And obviously brings a unique perspective there. Also sits on the Science Committee. Mark Wayne Mullen, I think, is the quintessential Eastern Oklahoma guy. Small business guys, Cherokee, so we doubled the number of enrolled Native American tribal members in Congress. Both conservative Republicans, I always like to point out to my tribal friends. But he's playing a really significant role in transportation. And, of all things, one of the places he's really starting to make a difference is inland waterways because of the Kerr-McClellan waterway over there. Bill Schuster, who's the chairman of that committee, really likes him. And he's moved some legislation, been very helpful on Native American issues at the Natural Resources Committee. So I think they'll both do a good job, quite frankly. And, we're certainly happy to have them in the delegation. With that, thank you guys very much. And let me just end and thank Pete and thank this organization. Both of us were commenting what an extraordinary turnout this is in August. And I know this doesn't have anything to do with me. What I know is collectively how much all of you care about, Central Oklahoma, obviously, but our entire state and our entire country, and the interest and the focus that Oklahomans have on making the world better. And just getting up and going to work every morning is something that the country would do well to not only value but to emulate. So I'm very, very proud to be from this state, and particularly this part of this state. So thank you for your leadership.
Thank you, Tom. It's a real honor for me to have you here as the guest at the Chairman's Breakfast. I do want to remind you, we talked a little bit about education, how important it is. State of the Schools is August 22nd, so please attend if you can. We are adjourned. Have a great day.